So, welcome to our natural language processing seminar. It's my honor to introduce our today's invited talk. It's by Daniel Zeman. He is a scientist at the Prague University, Charles University in Prague, and the co-founder of Universal Dependencies. And he will talk about the Universal Dependency Initiative today.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure coming here. And I will be talking about this project today. It's an Universal Dependencies is a multilingual international effort in dependency tree banking. And as I've been told, there are probably some people in the audience who know what it is about. I know about at least two of you who know very well. But I will not assume that this is the case in general, so I will spend the first half of my talk by giving you the background on universal dependencies, and then in the second part I will focus on some interesting phenomena that are interesting, especially in Slavic languages when they are applied to UD. So I will be showing a lot of diagrams like these three. Essentially, this is a sentence syntactic structure where we are just missing the words so far here. There are part of speech tags representing the words, and there are relations between the words. So there's like a determiner, noun, verb, another determiner, another noun, conjunction, and noun. And all three have the same underlying sequence of part of speech tags. So you may have thought that there would be a high probability of having the same syntactic structure, even though it's obviously not granted. But it's not. It looks like these structures suggest that the sentences are completely syntactically different if the arrows really represent syntactic structure. And in fact, if you compare them, there's just one dependency link shared between the first two structures, and there are just two shared between number 1 and number 3, and then there's nothing in common between number 2 and number 3. So it looks like different syntax, right? In fact, it's not, because these particular examples are three sentences in three different languages: English, Danish, and Swedish. But they are really not just the same meaning, but also really syntactically equivalent. You can map them one to one on each other, and so the only reason why we have three different structures here is that's not a difference between languages, but that's a difference in the design decisions taken by people who designed the annotation schemes for the tree bank. So it happens that the first one is one particle conversion of the pen tree bank into dependencies. The second one is according to the Danish dependency tree bank guidelines, and the third one is the Tolbanken tree bank of Swedish. And all of these are annotation styles that appeared some like 12 years ago with the first Karola shared task in parsing, which was the sparking moment in the interest of in parsing multiple languages at once. And this is a problem, right? Because if you do anything multilingual in NLP and with parsing or morphology or whatever, and you want to compare your results across languages, or maybe even do some transfer of models from one language to another, it will not work if you have these differences there. And it's also a problem for linguists. Whoever wants to do research on annotated corpora and find various phenomena there, when they switch to a new language, they have to learn new annotation scenario, and it takes time and it takes effort. So if you just work within one language, one tree bank, it's probably not a problem for you, but once you try to do anything across tree banks, you have to care about it. So People were aware that this is a problem, and roughly around 2011 there started to be various efforts to find out some annotation scheme that could be possibly applied to all the languages, and to which all the existing tree banks could be converted so that we have a common lingua franca that could be used for all the data sets. And there were multiple such efforts, but eventually they merged into what we now know as universal dependencies. So this is the main motto and the main objective of UD. We want same things to be annotated the same way across all the languages. But that's just one part of the objective. There is another one, sort of contradictory. We don't really want to make all the languages look the same. So we want to be able to emphasize various differences that different languages take in coding strategies, how to encode the same meaning, same construction in slightly different ways. So these obviously go against each other, and we have to find a balance. And in fact, UD is a balance along multiple dimensions, not just these two. And it has been first formulated by Chris Manning from Stanford University, and since then the rest of us usually refers to this as the Manning's law. And it says that the secret to understanding UD is to realize that the design is a subtle compromise between approximately 6 things. One of them is that it must be satisfactory for linguistic analysis for individual languages. That's, I guess, obvious, but it also should work for linguistic typology so that you can compare structures across languages. And you can highlight the differences, but also see the parallelism where it matters. Then it must be suitable for rapid and consistent annotation by a human annotator. And both the words rapid and consistent are important, so it should be simple. It should not be very complex annotation scheme that takes ages to learn and to apply consistently. Related to that, it should also be usable by non-linguists, like NLP engineers or maybe language learners, people who in general are not educated in general linguistics, but they have some knowledge of grammar, maybe of their own language, so they will know the traditional terminology, but not necessarily all the concepts of language typology. So we want to stick with traditional terminology whenever possible. Unfortunately, it's not always possible, simply because the traditions, there are so many traditions you can choose from, and they conflict again. So in order to annotate the same thing the same way, we have to pick one term and suppress the others from the other frameworks. And finally, 2 more technical objectives. UD should be suitable for computer parsing, hopefully with high accuracy, and it should also support downstream language understanding tasks such as relation, extraction, and so on. So, and then finally, the conclusion here is important, that it is easy to come up with an improvement of UD along one of these dimensions, but remaining sensitive to all of them, that's the difficult and interesting part. And it's a compromise, so if you find UD perfect, then along all the dimensions, then it probably is not balanced enough, because it's not supposed to be perfect, because it cannot be perfect along all the dimensions. There will have to be something sacrificed everywhere. So now, let me show you just the first brief example of what we mean by annotating the same thing the same way. Here's a very simple example from English. George killed the dragon. There is a verb, the subject, and the object, and a determiner. And if I show you the same sentence in Irish, I'm not even trying to pronounce it, but it's the same word, same structure, just a different word order. The trees are isomorphic. The word order is different, but otherwise the structure is the same. Another example, Jorge mató al dragón in Spanish. Here we already have one slight problem. The word al it's not really a determiner, it's rather a contraction of a preposition and a determiner. So there are those question marks because it's not obvious what part of speech tag it should take and what relation it should take. And there are multiple possible solutions to this. The UD solution is that in order to be able to do this without any presuppositions about a particular language, we just say that if you encounter things like that, you have to split the surface token into multiple syntactic words. So syntactic words is something that we believe is syntactically autonomous, and they are not necessarily always mapped to, directly to orthographic words. And in this case, we say there is a surface token, which is a multi-word token split into two words. Once we do that, it works again because we have a preposition and we have a determiner. Both of them exist in Spanish as well as in other languages, so we know what to do with them. And finally, I have a Czech example, traka zabelíří. There is, again, a slightly different word order. There is no determiner here, no preposition, but otherwise, again, the backbone is isomorphic to the rest. Now, at this moment, you may think that by annotating the same thing same way, we mean annotating the same meaning same way. It's not the case. Same meaning is not necessarily the same syntactic construction. So here's another set of examples. Now, all of them in English. He killed the dragon is one of them, very similar to the previous one. And the dragon was killed by him, active and passive. And these are syntactically different, so even though we want to make them somewhat similar so that the downstream language understanding tasks don't have hard time mapping the semantic rows to the syntactic constituents, we still want to see actually a different syntactic tree because these are two different syntactic constructions. You could also have things like his killing of the dragon, a nominalization, or the dragon that was killed, there's a relative clause. It's not exactly 100% the same meaning, but still it's around the same concept, just expressed in a different way. So we have different trees here, right? So this was just the first demonstration of UD. Now a little bit more detailed, I will give you a tour through UD, through the main concepts that are in there. So starting from the lowest level, which is word segmentation. There are various problems in word segmentation depending on the language. In some languages it's just the low-level tokenization. You have to cut off punctuation symbols and that's it. At the other end of the scale, there are languages like Chinese or Vietnamese where you don't really have any word boundaries visible in the text and you have to do something about it. And somewhere in the middle, or maybe closer to the first case, we have things like the Spanish example. Here's another example we repeat a lot. Again from Spanish, vámonos al mar, meaning let's go to the sea. And there are two contractions. Vámonos is split to vámonos, and al is split to al. So that we have words that are well defined in terms of part of speech categories, and we can work with them. And one important aspect of this is that the data format that UD uses makes sure that the original surface forms are preserved and the mapping is preserved so that no information is lost. And you can train a language model that will learn from data how to do this segmentation on new words. Obviously, it should be quite easy for Spanish, where there is a limited set of contractions. It will be much more difficult for languages like Arabic or even Chinese. But this should actually not be very strange for you, because Polish has examples of very similar stuff as well. The agglutinating auxiliaries, like in cośmy jeszcze zanedbali, cośmy should be split into co and the pronoun and the auxiliary in a very similar way to the Spanish example. Next level is morphology. And this example is from Czech. Některé dívky si nicméně pochvalovaly zmrzlinu, meaning some girls nevertheless praised the ice cream. And pretty standard set of annotations. There are lemmas. These are optional, so not all prebanks in UD have them, but most of them do. So the base form, based dictionary form representing the lexeme. Then there are part of speech tags. quite coarse-grained, and a set of morphological features, possibly either providing a more fine-grained partition of the part of speech space, or providing various inflectional categories that you may need to encode. So, in a little bit more detail, these are the part of speech text. There is a fixed set of 17 categories that is supposed to be enough for all the languages in the world. Not necessarily all the languages have to use all of them. So it's possible that in a language there is no auxiliary verbs, for instance. But no one is supposed to extend this set by any new categories. If there is a distinction that you believe is important in a language and it cannot be distinguished here, then you are supposed to pick one of these coarse-grained classes and then use the features to provide the distinction that you need. And the features, those are extensible. So these are, I think, currently 23 features that are defined on the universal level of the guidelines. And again, they are defined there because we want people to use the same labels for the same thing, as long as they have the same thing in their language. These are actually just dimensions of meaning, so each of them has a number of possible values, which are not listed here, but they are listed in the documentation. But everyone is allowed to extend this set if they need it by new features or new values of the existing features. So it is essentially not limited. If you believe there is something missing here, you can define it and you should document it. But there is some mental limit, so we don't really want everyone to define hundreds of new features, but fortunately it's not really happening right now. And occasionally, if we see that there's a feature which people have defined in a new language or new tree bank, and it has been attested in other tree banks as well, then we start thinking about, okay, maybe this is something that will be needed by other people as well, so we should put it in the documentation so that it's more visible and the new people will choose the same label for that. Now, at the third level of syntax, the main principle here is that we give rather high priority to content words as opposed to various functional elements in the sentence, which is something that not all linguists really like, because it goes against some other objectives that you may want to follow in syntax. But it is very well motivated by the parallelism that we want to see. And if you want to see parallel tree structures across languages, then it's quite likely that if you connect the content words first, then you will have the same backbone, and then the function words are much more likely to differ in the languages. So if they are not in the middle of the tree but rather as a leaf node, then it's easier to deal with them so that they don't distort the rest of the structure. So here's an example from English. The dog was chased by the cat, and its Bulgarian counterpart kuče to se presedváše od kotkata. And the blue links here that connect the content words, they are perfectly parallel because there's the same base structure. But then there are function words, and those are not so parallel because just one language uses function words, the other language may use morphology for the same thing or nothing at all. So as we see here, the definiteness feature provided by the definite article in the English sentence, there's no definite article in Bulgarian. Instead, the same feature is marked directly by morphology on the noun. The same for the past tense. In English, the past auxiliary was is responsible for making it past tense, while in Bulgarian, presledvaše is a finite form directly containing the past feature. Then the passive is again periphrastic in English. Again, the auxiliary is sort of responsible for that together with the participle. So the participle itself is not passive. The auxiliary is not passive, but together they are creating the passive form. While in Bulgarian, the only element responsible for making it passive-like is the reflexive marker se. And then there is this agent phrase by the cat and od kotkata, and again there's definite article up there and nothing like that down here, and there is a preposition for both of them. Now Bulgarian can also have the periphrastic passive as in English, so you could also have kučeto beše presledmáno od kotkata, and now it's more parallel, but still the backbone is the same, but the red links and the features may have changed. So now the past tense is with the auxiliary as well here. And I could also show you a Czech example of that, pes byl honěn kočkou. And this is, in the passive part, it's much more similar to English, except that the agent phrase kočkou does not need any preposition like in English. Instead, there's the instrumental case marked morphologically, so we have the feature here, sort of corresponds to the by preposition up there. We have a number of predefined labels for the dependencies. They are important because without the label you couldn't really tell what the arrows mean. There are currently 37 of them. I'm not going into real details of all the relation labels. I will just emphasize briefly that those highlighted ones, subject, object, and oblique, are the most important distinction probably among all the distinctions that are made here. And that's the distinction between core arguments and oblique dependence of verbs. That is something that UD taxonomy is organized around a lot. And I will talk a little bit more about it when I get to the Slavic specific part of my talk. Like with features, it is possible to define new relations for syntax if you need more distinctions, either to preserve some annotation that you had in your previous treatment which you are converting to UD, or to preserve something that you just believe is important in your language. But you are supposed to say what universally defined relation this is subtype of, so that people who don't care or who are not able to deal with all these new relations can always back off to the universal part of the relation and make assumptions about it based on the universal documentation without necessarily knowing the fine-grained distinctions that are valid in your language. And it's not always really specific to one language. And the first example here is a very good example of that. ACL means just ad nominal clause, so that's a clause that is modifying a nominal. And there's a very widely attested subtype of that, and it's a relative clause. So it is really, you will find it in many languages. I don't dare to say in all languages, but in many of them. So all three banks of these languages could have ACL : relcal. But it's optional, so maybe some languages have relative clauses, but they don't have the distinction available in their data. So you cannot count on that being present. But if you want to annotate relative clauses, then again, you're supposed to use the same label as other people already used. So that's why these subtypes should also be documented, not just because people want to know what happens in that particular language, but because they may actually want to do the same thing elsewhere. Now, I'm going to show you a few, definitely not all, but a few interesting constructions still at the universal level. And one really interesting thing is coordination. It's interesting everywhere in dependency work, simply because it's not dependency relation, so it's difficult to capture in a dependency framework. And without going into details of all the possibilities that you have in capturing coordination, I will just tell you that UD leans towards using something that's been known as the Stanford Coordination, which essentially means that the first conjunct is used as sort of head, even though it's not really claiming that it's a head in the linguistic syntactic sense. It's just arbitrary head because you have to make one of them the head in the dependency tree. And the other conjuncts, here Dewey and Louis, are attached to the first one. And if there are any delimiters like punctuation and conjunction, then they are attached to the immediately following conjunct. Now, I said that this is arbitrary. This is just saying all the conjuncts are really at the same level, but we just have to pick one of them as the representative of the entire phrase. But in fact, not all people are really happy with that, even within the community, because there are languages like Turkish and actually all the other Turkic languages, or Japanese and Korean, which are prevailingly right-headed. So people who work with these languages believe that even if coordination is an arbitrary technical structure where you don't claim that the head is really a head, they still would like to see that arbitrary thing to be the last conjunct rather than the first one, and to have it like mirrored everything. So there have been heavy discussions about this in UD, and I'm pretty sure there will be discussions going on for the possible next version of the guidelines. But currently, according to the current guidelines, this is actually not legal to see something like this in the UD data. And if you do that, the validating software we have will scream at you. But it's quite possible that in the future it will be allowed for per language base to decide that in this language coordinations are always right-headed and not left-headed. Now, speaking about coordination, there's another interesting and complex or difficult phenomenon, and that's ellipsis. And in particular, one type of ellipsis that's usually referred to as gapping, where you have two predicates and the second one is deleted from the sentence, like in this example, Kate went to Florida and Jane to Europe. And it's understood like, and Jane went to Europe. And you would want to have the went there because you would want to attach Jane as its subject and to Europe as its adverbial modifier. But you can't if you don't have the note there. So that's a problem. The problem here is that you are missing the potential head word where you could attach stuff to. Some tree banks outside UD would have empty nodes to account for that. Now in UD, at least in what's called basic representation there, we don't have empty nodes because it's considered to be too complex both for the users and for any tools, parsers and stuff. But there is actually another layer in UD which is called enhanced representation, and that allows, among other things, to introduce the empty nodes. So if it's basic representation, we have to do something else. We have to ignore this invisible possible empty node, and instead we have to pick one of the orphans as the arbitrary representative of that phrase. So there are rules that say, okay, we should choose the one that would be the subject, which is Jane in this case, and that will represent the conjunct. So it's now connected to the first full conjunct as the representative of the incomplete conjunct here. Jane is the head of this thing. And then, because we don't really want to preserve the original label of this dependency that would go from the verb to Europe, so instead we have a new label, orphan, which is used just in these cases when there's a predicate missing. And it doesn't tell a lot. It just tells, warning, there is something weird here. Something is missing. So you should not really trust this relation. And that's an approximation. Now if you have the enhanced representation, and it is something that is optional, so not all UD banks have this. But if they have enhanced representation, then they are allowed to introduce the empty node only in the enhanced representation. And then you can use all the original relations that should be there according to the guidelines. So this is a more complex tree that will show you the full story, while that one is the easier one. It's not the only thing in enhanced representations. There is currently, I think, 4 or 5 different things. It's still sort of beta version, so the enhanced representation will probably evolve in the near future, and people are still discussing what should be included there. But currently there are these roughly 4 to 5 things. The second one is about control verbs. So if you noticed, I have now made the example a little bit more complex. There is now not Kate goes to Florida, but Kate wants to go to Florida. So we have 2 empty nodes here, wants to go to Europe. And that's on purpose, because I wanted to show you a control structure where the subject of the second verb is inherited from the first verb. So to go did not have its own subject in the basic representation, but the red link now shows to the semantic applications that you may apply to find the real meaning, that look, there's a subject over there which is semantically also the subject of to go. And since we have now the empty nodes here, we can do the same thing for the empty nodes. Jane wants and Jane goes. And now not all the morphosyntactic rules that you would like to apply to subjects will hold anymore, because there may not be agreement between the verb and the subject, but it's the semantic help, semantic clue that this is also the subject in the semantic sense. If we get back to coordination, there's another thing that you may want to mark in the enhanced UD, and that's the shared or private dependence. So if you say Jane eats sweet apples and oranges, it could mean potentially 2 things. Either Jane eats sweet apples and sweet oranges, so sweet is shared modifier of both the conjuncts, or it could mean something like sweet apples and non-sweet, bitter oranges, especially if there will be an overt modifier before oranges, then it will be clear or very probable that sweet doesn't apply to both. But if you don't see it, then it's not so clear. So the annotator has the possibility now to mark that sweet is a shared modifier by doing the other link from oranges to sweet. And we also project eats to oranges, because oranges is also object of eats. But that's deterministic. That's not so difficult, because you can always project it across from above, across the coordination. Finally, the final thing that's done in enhanced UD is about relative clauses. This is a real example from the Polish tree bank. Gdzie szukać szamponu, który myje. So który is the relative pronoun, and normally in the basic representation it's the subject of myje. But again, semantically, it is actually important that it refers to shampoo. So you want to see the subject link down here. And then, because we want the structure to stay connected, we use a new label ref here, just to attach to Kture and not to have 2 subjects in the same of the same predicate. So now you also can see that the enhanced representation is actually no longer a tree. It's a general graph. In most of the time, it is still a directed acyclic graph. But in this particular case, it's not even acyclic, because we have a cycle here. We have one relation going there and the other going the other way around. So that's so far what we have with the enhanced representation. I don't think we really have parsers for that so far, but we have some tools that are trying to go from the basic representation heuristically to the enhanced representation, so you can combine an existing parser with that enhancer, and you would get an approximate structure like this. And as you have seen, there are occasionally decisions that have to be made and that are not deterministic. So, like the shared dependence here. So, that was the tour. Where are we now? I believe it's great, because we've managed to create what I call a snowball effect, that now people really want to be part of that effort. And not only that we are growing and new tree banks are converted to UD, but also I believe some of the additions are actually people who would not think about making a tree bank at all. But then they say, okay, there are so many languages now and my language is not there. Why? Maybe I should do something for my master thesis, and because they take just 1,000 sentences or even 1,000 words as a sample, so it's always better than nothing. And it is, actually. You can even train a model on 1,000 words, and it's probably going to be better than any unsupervised model. So even though it's still bad. So you still want to enlarge a tree bank. But usually when someone starts a tree bank, then there's a high chance that someone else will pick up and it will eventually grow. So we now have like 75 languages and almost 130 tree banks. So as you can see, for some languages there are multiple tree banks. Altogether, it's over 18 million tokens, but there are huge differences in sizes. Some of the tree banks are really just small samples, while others are over 1 million tokens together. And what I believe is very important is that there are over 280 contributors, and not all of them are active the same way and all the time, but still it sort of illustrates that the community is growing. We've had 2 UD workshops so far. There probably will be another one next year, and we've had 2 shared tasks now in parsing directly UD. And I guess you know that because you have also quite successful team here at the Institute. Another way of looking at the growth of the project, this is the blue line is the growing number of languages that are covered, and the green line is the number of tree banks. And it looks like there is a steady progress, and we hope that it will hold for some time still. So this is the current picture, the 75 languages. Sometimes actually you would see in our automatic statistics 76. That's because we now have one tree bank that's Hindi-English code switching, and we really couldn't classify it as either Hindi or English, so it's counted there as a new language. So there's still a huge bias towards large languages, and especially the Indo-European languages, but that's because we built it bottom up. Whatever was available was added. And fortunately, we are now making progress towards other language families, and so that the variability is modeled in a more plastic way. So this brings me to the second part of my talk, and that's the Slavic specific phenomena. Slavic languages are now represented quite well in UD. Even though again with various sizes, and as I said, there are multiple tree banks for some languages, so it's like 12 languages covered, and I think only a few Slavic languages are still missing, but it's around 21 tree banks, I guess, including 2 Polish tree banks, and I've been actually responsible for converting the first one, the Składnica Zależnościowa, to UD, even though originally I think it's Alina's work or from here. And then recently we had the LFG tree bank by Adam and Agnieszka added to UD, a larger one, and I think we have to talk about how to make them more similar to each other. And then we have 5 Czech tree banks and 4 Russian tree banks, and so on. So let's look at what's interesting in here. And there are many interesting things, so I just had to select some of them. So I think the oldest sort of controversy pertaining to Slavic annotation is in the domain of part of speech tags, and that's the distinction between pronouns and determiners. Determiner is something that's used routinely in English and also in Romance languages, and essentially it means it's either an article or something pronominal like which syntactically behaves like adjectives. Depending on what language you are in, the definition might be more specific or less specific or different. So in English you would typically require that there is just one determiner per noun phrase, while in Romance languages it may not be so obvious. But anyway, a determiner is something that's not normally used in Slavic languages, at least those that where I've looked for that. I'm not sure about Polish, but I would bet that it's traditionally not here either. But we do have the words. We have the pronoun. We don't have articles, but we have pronouns that are more attributive-like and pronouns that are more substantive, of substantive nature. And it makes sense to distinguish them. So why not use these labels, even though it will be stretching the original notion of English determiner a bit further, to distinguish the adjective-like pronouns from the other ones. And in fact, we are not in UD. We are not the first ones to do that. I later found out that, at least in this book by Sussex and Karola and Slavic languages, they actually use the term determiner for Slavic languages without trying to precisely define it. I believe they just use it because for the English readership, they believe it will be familiar. So the question is, how do we define it, especially if it's not defined traditionally? And the question actually appears in the non-Slavic languages as well. Originally in UD version 1 guidelines, the definition was a very functional one, essentially saying if you say this car is expensive, it modifies a noun phrase, so it's determiner, while this is expensive, it replaces a noun phrase, so it's a pronoun. But this didn't work very well because it was really context dependent very much. You always have some distinctions that are context dependent, but the question is, do we want to make part of speech text so context dependent if you can get the information from the syntactic tree anyways? So later on it was made less strict for version 2. Less strict, unfortunately, also means that there is more room for people to be creative about applying the distinction. So I believe, at least in Slavic languages, it probably makes sense to look at the word. If it should be grounded in a lexicon rather than dependent on context, then the lexicon will tell you whether the word is capable of modifying a noun phrase and not necessarily replacing it. And in Slavic languages, it usually means that the word can inflect for gender, because adjectives will modify a noun and will agree with the noun in gender. So if the word can do it, then it is capable of acting as a determiner, and then it could be labeled as determiner everywhere, because the syntax will tell you whether in that particular tree it actually is not a determiner, but in the syntactic sense, but it's rather a subject. So that's one thing. Another thing where also the traditional terminology will not tell you a lot, because there are different traditions in different languages or even different frameworks within one language, is the verb forms. There are various non-finite verb forms which are sort of syntactically and morphologically, they are somewhere on the border, in the border area between verbs and some other part of speech. So participle, for instance, it's something like a verbal adjective. And depending on what grammar you look at, it might tell you that some of them are actually adjectives that are derived from verbs. For some others, you will hear that they are verbal forms quite clearly, and somewhere else it's not clear whether it's a tradition or a decision of a particular corpus designer, so it's difficult. A similar thing is adverbial participles, or variously called transgressives, converbs, or even gerunds, which again could be verbs or adverbs. And as a matter of fact, they are mostly classified as verbal forms. I mean, verb is the main part of speech tag, and then there's this verb form. In the North Slavic, tree banks, while in the South Slavic, I think they usually mark it as adverbs. But that is something that I believe could be sort of negotiated in a like Slavic-wide UD group. And we could settle with one label, because then you can map it to whatever you prefer if you present it to a group that prefers one particular terminology. Another thing is verbal nouns. Again, I thought for a while that at least these are easy, but then I found out that actually in the Polish tree banks they are the preferences is the other than I would have thought was the default. And even you can see that there's actually a gerund used here and gerund used for the converb. So that this English term is used for two different things depending on what author you read. So that's another thing, that if you have two national terminologies and then you try to map them to English-speaking terminology, the result may not be always the same. So we need to settle at a similar treatment in the languages that behave similarly. But so far, I think it is something that can be done. It's just negotiating and deciding where we want to sacrifice something and where not. But there's also a problem of subclassifying the individual words here, and I will show that on the case of participles, where we need to distinguish the different types of participles. In Slavic languages, you can have up to 5 different participle types, if I'm not mistaken. In some languages, I think Russian is one example. And you want some features to be able to tell you which kind of participle it is. So what I will show here is an example of what is usually called the L participle, because there's L often involved in the suffix. And the problem is that if we want to look for features that within the universally defined features, like past tense, because this is a past tense participle, so why not call it tense equals to past? Then we will find out that not even within the Slavic family it is applicable in all the languages. So here's the example. If we look at the East Slavic languages, Ana prišla k němu, that's Russian, she came to him. Here, prišla, came, even though originally I would say it's a participle-like form, it's non-finite, it is actually in the T-Bank's label as finite, and that's because there's no auxiliary needed, and it's the only verb form that's needed in the sentence to present the past tense. But it is tense past because that's the prototypical meaning of the verb form, even though it's not necessarily always used just for past tense. Because if you say "Я хотел бы поблагодарить," then this is conditional, but not past tense. It's "I would like to thank blah blah blah" to someone. So that means that because we are confined to labeling individual words and not the entire verbal cluster, we have to approximate it and use some of the features. And then later, if you want to infer some properties of the entire clause, you have to combine the auxiliaries together with this, and then you may come up with some feature that you will not see at any of the individual words, but you can infer them on a language particle basis. So this is Czech. It is slightly different. Přišel si nás zabít. That's actually a violent example, but in fact I created this when I was trying to get a counterpart of the old Czech Slavonic example, so it's taken from the Bible originally. So came, you came to kill us. Here we have an auxiliary. So that's not just the přišel, the past participle, but we also need the auxiliary. And together it makes the past tense. Even though this one is not past at all. This is prototypically present tense. But together with the participle, you can say this is past tense, second person. While if you omit the auxiliary here, like it was in Russian, it was omitted everywhere, it essentially is the equivalent of having the third person auxiliary there. So it means third person, but it's not visible anywhere, because this is not marked for person morphologically, but it is still past tense. If you, over there, exchange the auxiliary from si to by, přišel by nás zabít, now it's conditional again, as it was in Russian. But again, I think it essentially makes sense to say that this is still past participle, and then there would be a Czech-specific rule saying that the conditional auxiliary combined with the past participle will yield the conditional mood in the clause. This is Slovenian. Now we get the South Slavic, and this is even more complicated because first for a third person we now need the auxiliary as well. It's obligatory here. So přišel jedou vodovitve. This is third person, but present. This is participle. I no longer have the past participle here for good reason, and they don't have it in the T-Bank. And that's because of the left example over there. Dalej poste prišli is actually a future tense. And I think I've heard in Polish it's possible as well, is it? To use that participle. So if you can use a participle for future tense and for past tense, then it really doesn't seem to make sense anymore to call it past participle. So that's a problem that's even within the Slavic family. We don't have a good label for all the languages unless we resort to some Slavic specific thing and say it's DL participle and that's it. But we want to be able to distinguish it from the others. Like there is another past participle, the more adjectival one. He, having come from somewhere, přišel, she would be in Czech. I don't know how it would be in Polish. And that's a different kind. So you want to be able to distinguish the different forms. Finally, this is the Old Slavic, the Old Czech Slavonic example. Přišel si pogubit nás. And so again, that's sort of parallel to what I had in Czech. And this is a conditional, so it even existed there as well. But the annotation is not the same. And here I'm not sure whether I approve of that or not, because I'm not educated in Old Czech Slavonic. But obviously the reasoning here is that originally this participle was not primarily about past tense. It was rather about some kind of perfect aspect, or they say resultative aspect. I don't know what exactly the difference should be. And you could use it in various tenses and various moods. So it should be labeled by something like this. And that's what currently is in the Old Czech Slavonic tree bank in UD. So that was about terminology. I think we could talk about it for a long time, but this was just two examples. Now I promised I would get back to the core versus oblique argument distinction. In short, UD does not want to distinguish arguments from adjuncts because it's considered to be too elusive at some places and too difficult to distinguish what is still obligatory or argument-like. And the idea is that in language typology, which is much more portable across languages, is the distinction between core arguments and oblique dependents. And that supposedly should be something that's much more easier to account for, although it turns out that it's not so easy to find out what exactly it means in individual languages. Once you know what it means in your language, you will have easy means of distinguishing it in that language. But it's not easy to come up with what it means. So what it's supposed to mean? It's supposed to mean that you distinguish subject of intransitive verb or the agent-like argument of transitive verb as the subject, and you distinguish the patient or direct object of transitive verb. And these two are, if I just talk about nominals, not about clauses, these are considered to be core arguments, and everything else is oblique, whether it is adjunct like adverbial location or whatever, or more borderline cases like benefactors and addressees, or even things that are really valency licensed by the verb, but still use some non-core way of encoding, like a preposition. To give you more examples of that, in English, there is once again an example of a sentence, of two sentences that have the same meaning, but they will have two different trees. He gave John the book, and he gave the book to John. And the distinction here is that to John is an oblique way of encoding an argument. Because in English, if you have a preposition, it cannot be core encoding, while bare noun phrases usually are core arguments, with some exceptions. Like if you say, I did it this week, then this week doesn't have any preposition and it still is an adjunct, which just determines the time. But most of the time you can say that preposition in English equals to oblique marking. And that means that the second clause there, he gave the book to John, is monotransitive, there's just one object, while the first one is ditransitive, there are two objects, John and the book. Now, it doesn't mean that preposition is the disqualifying element in all the languages. Some languages will have adpositions for all arguments, including the core ones, like Japanese. And in Spanish, for instance, it is not even in Spanish it is clear whether a preposition with the addressee in verbs of giving should qualify as a core argument or not. If you just look at the English example, he gave the book to John, and the Spanish dio el libro a John, it looks like it's perfectly the same thing. It should be oblique here and there. It should be the same thing. But it's not so easy in Spanish, because in Spanish you actually have the a preposition even with animate direct objects. And we had this example in the beginning, Jorge mató al dragón, so there was this preposition even with direct object. So you would have to say, if prepositions were disqualifying in Spanish, that you don't have any animate objects in Spanish, which is probably something that we don't want to say, because that would be too far. And again, we would have to remember the Manning's law. We could define it, we could enforce it, but then we would be too far from the traditional understanding, and that might be difficult for ordinary users, and so on. But it's not so clear even in Slavic languages, because you have to make sure that once you're starting with a new language and finding how the UD guidelines apply to this language, you should not start with your traditional terminology and infer from that terminology something using the UD guidelines. An example here would be that I'd say, okay, in Slavic, in Czech, I know what is subject and what is object, and the guidelines tell me that subject and object are core arguments. Now, the traditional grammar of Czech, not just the school grammar, but including like university level linguistics, will define object essentially the same way as arguments are usually defined. So you will have prepositional objects. You will have objects in all the cases, not all cases, but many cases, not just accusative, but also dative and instrumental and genitive. And it's probably not how it was meant. But if you look at typological literature, it will not necessarily mention that particular language. So you still don't know whether these cases count or not count. And in fact, my own attitude to this has evolved a lot. Initially, in the beginnings of UD, I didn't believe in that, or I essentially took the inverse definition. I said, okay, I know what is object, and object is core, so all the prepositional objects will be core objects in Czech. Then later I decided, well, maybe that's not a good idea, so prepositions should not be prepositional object. Those should not be objects in Czech, as they are not in English. And now, even though it's not yet in the data, I'm leaning towards saying that in the sense UD defines object, not even dative and instrumental can be called object. But as you can see, if I cannot decide quickly how it should be done in Czech, then how could the other people decide if they were just exposed to UD for a shorter time? So, and that's something that's difficult that we have to talk about within the Slavic group and then within the larger group, because it's not just Slavic. German behaves very similarly to these languages, including the traditional terminology there. So it is actually not so easy to apply core versus oblique arguments until you decide what it means in the language. Then once you decide that particular morphological encoding is or is not core, then it should be easy for the annotators. So from that moment on, it actually works as expected. There's another thing that's specific to Slavic and Romance languages and some Germanic, and that's quite related to this, and that's reflexive pronouns. Sorry. Or maybe reflexive markers, because some people would not agree that these are pronouns anymore. So what I mean is the short clitic se and its equivalents in various Slavic languages, while there would be a longer form sebe, sebě, which are usually not so problematic. But these short forms can be either reflexive, and reflexive here means the co-reference between object and the subject of the same clause, or they could have some additional functions that have nothing to do with, and they are no longer referential there.
Can you translate this example?
Yeah, sorry. Řízl se do prstu means he cut himself in the finger, while řízl ho do prstu means he cut him, someone else, in the finger. In this case, I believe that it still counts as really true reflexive clause, because so that means that ho and se both are objects, and they should be labeled as objects, and the fact that it's co-referential with the subject, that's a secondary thing that you may or may not want to mark, but the pronoun se will probably be marked as reflexive anyway in the features, so you could find it out. In Slavic languages it also includes reciprocal usage, so they kissed each other in English, that's a multi-word expression with reciprocal meaning. In German, you would have einander, which would be one pronoun, but which is specifically reciprocal. While in Slavic, this is originally a reflexive pronoun, which can be used reciprocally as well. So políbili se means like they kissed, he kissed her and she kissed him. So there's like two relations semantically, but syntactically, I think it is still okay, and it is done so in the tree banks, to mark se as just the object. While there are other examples which are no longer referential in the same sense, and one of them is the class of inherently reflexive verbs, and those are verbs where the se word is no longer contributing any meaning to the clause. It just is there. It is supposed to be there, but the verb does not ever occur without the se, or it does, but with a significantly different meaning. So smatse, batse, I think there are equivalents of that. Love and fear are equivalents in many Slavic languages, meaning that you just use the se there, and you have to attach it somehow because it's in the sentence, but you should not use the object label for that, because it's no longer an object. It doesn't really mark any patient or anything. So the rule in UD is to use the expletive label for that, and if you want to distinguish the different sub-functions of those expletively used se, then this one should be PV, which supposedly means pronominal verb. In the first versions of UD there was a compound relation. It was later discarded, but I think even though it's now discarded by the guidelines, it is still used in the Serbian tree bank. Yeah?
So we were very curious with Agnieszka where this term comes from, and Google doesn't tell us, pronominal verb. It seems to be UD specific, and it's just so strange.
It is strange to me as well. I can tell you the history. There was still in the time of UD version 1, there was a meeting in Uppsala, which was like split into working groups, working in parallel. And because I couldn't be in all the groups at the same time, I wasn't part of this group which worked on the reflexives. But then they came up with this term. So I just took it, okay, that's the label that we are now supposed to use. I know there was at least, I think there was Jelko Agic as a representative of Croatian, maybe the only Slavic-speaking guy in that group, and then there were a number of people speaking Romance languages. So maybe in Romance languages this is something that's used there. I don't know.
It's very misleading, right? Because there's no pronoun there. I mean, say is not a pronoun in these verbs in any possible sense.
You could say it's a pronoun originally. Well, yeah, you're right, but I think, well, we could like make an effort to rename it, but then we would have to convince all the tree banks that already use it to change it, and I think it's not worth the effort right now. So yeah, so that's, some tree banks actually use just expel here, because again, this is a subtype, so you are not required to use that subtype, but you are supposed to use expel if it has this non-function. Reflexive passive. That's another thing. I know Adam disagrees with calling it passive, but it's a traditional term in Czech grammar, for instance. To se snadněji řekne, než udělá. Essentially, this means that if I say it literally, this says itself easier than it does itself. Which obviously it doesn't mean that the inanimate subject will do anything. It rather means that it's acted upon. So it is sort of like passivizing the clause, but it's again using the expletive se instead of the more prototypical or widespread means of periphrastic construction with the auxiliary verb. So we use the pass there subtype to mark it as something in parallel with the passive auxiliary in "it was done" in English, but otherwise it's expletive again. There is something very similar and overlapping in some languages, which is called impersonal construction, which essentially you could say, and as a matter of fact the Polish tree-bank does it that way, the passive, what I call passive over there, is impersonal as well, because it really means that whatever looks like subject is not really the real doer of the action anymore. But impersonal here is presumably meant as extending that notion to verbs that are not originally transitive. So passive, you normally think of passive as something that transforms a transitive verb by demoting the original agent to an oblique position or discarding it completely from the sentence and promoting the original patient to the subject-like position. While with intransitives, you can still demote the original subject and discard it, but there's no object that you could promote to the subject position. So there will be no subject anymore. And so German is spoken here. Speak is intransitive, so German is not really an object. It's rather something like an adverbial, at least in the Czech Czech counterpart there. But the original subject disappears. So it's just zde se mluví německy. It means that it is spoken here. So far for the reflexive, I believe we could talk about it for a long time, and we probably will, because I'm here until tomorrow. Now, I think I should be ending in a few minutes, and I will. My final set of examples is about modal verbs. If you read the UD guidelines with the English examples there, it will tell you that modal auxiliaries, like all other auxiliaries, should be attached to the main verb. So in this example, I should have been waiting there, should have been, all of them are auxiliaries and are attached as leaves. So this is the waiting is the main verb, and it's the head of the sentence. That means that that we lose any hierarchy if there was any, but we are treating all the auxiliaries the same way as I sketched in the beginning, in the first part of the talk. But it also means that we will lose some parallelism, and because we will not do the same thing in Czech. And this actually is something that as far as I know, we did the same way in all the Slavic tree-banks so far, so there was probably no real controversy about this, but we do it differently from English. The one thing why we are entitled to do it differently from English is that it's no longer an auxiliary in Czech. In English you have some established tests that will tell you whether a verb is auxiliary or not. Like if you invert it to create a question, if you say I do that, and the question is what do you do, so you have to put the other do there as auxiliary. While if you say I should do that, then you ask what should you do. So the should is auxiliary because it can create a question for you just by inversion without introducing a new auxiliary there. So that's one of several tests that will tell you that should is an auxiliary. I'm not aware of any such tests for Slavic languages, at least not such that would tell you that the modal verbs will have to be treated the same way as the auxiliary beat or bitch or whatever is the form in the particular language. So if we have the counterpart of the previous sentence, byla bych tam měla čekat, these two are still auxiliaries and they are treated as such, while the modal now becomes the head of the sentence, and the infinitive of the other verb has to be attached as a controlled verb via this excomp relation, like if I say he wants to go or whatever we have had in the previous example. So we lose the parallelism here, but we keep parallelism to other things where the modal is not even a verb, like in Russian mě nádobí vypít vody it's necessary for me, so I should drink water. Here nado is not a verb, so it would not count as auxiliary probably unless we stretch it even farther. But it will be parallel to what I had in the Czech slide, because there is excom between měla and čekat, and there is excom between the predicative here and vypit, the infinitive. And in fact, if you go back to English, I need to drink some water will be parallel to this Russian sentence, and that will be because need is not an auxiliary, unlike should or would. So even in English, it's not parallel. It depends on whether it's auxiliary or not. And that's one principle that's actually, a problem that you will find in many places in UD and in any cross-lingual work, that you want to have exact lines dividing categories, but quite often there is a scale of grammaticalization and scale of whatever, and you have to draw the line somewhere, and there is this catastrophe principle that suddenly, so far to the line, you have one annotation, and from now on you have a different annotation, because the annotation decisions are not smooth. You have to switch from one to another. So I had these backup slides, and as expected, I will now skip them so that we have some time for discussion, but we can return to them if you are interested. So to wrap up, I think that UD has been successful so far. It is now sort of de facto standard. At least, not that necessarily everyone is supposed to work in UD, but it was not meant that way. But at least people think about convertibility of whatever they design to UD and from UD back. And Slavic languages are very well represented, but still we have to work a lot on finding out how to annotate these less clear examples so that the same thing is annotated the same way. And whoever is interested, I would like to encourage you to get involved either as users of the data or as contributors, because it's fun. So then you will become the member of this large and ever-growing growing community, and then I would like to thank you as well, and I'm happy to take questions.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
So I was hesitating because I'm quite critical about various aspects of UD, but I'm trying to be critical in a constructive way, right? So when I write something, I'm trying to propose what it should look like. And most of the stuff I'm critical about, I already wrote in the calling paper and the language sources evaluation paper. So I don't want to take too much time, but I think that this core-non-core distinction is really quite a fundamental problem, and both in theory and in practice. So I think that the current guidelines, which suggest that accusatives are objects, they are simply wrong for various reasons that I wrote about quite a lot. And the other thing is that if you treat clauses and complements as objects, that causes all kinds of problems. So I think this aspect really needs to be revised, because it's both fundamental for UD and really problematic. So that's just my quick comments to start making the discussion. I don't want to take much time, as I said.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's a problem, and definitely claims like accusative is object are wrong at the universal level, because there's nothing universal actually that you could say. Just like you cannot say that prepositions are always oblique. So, but what I think is desperately needed in UD, but we just don't have staff to do that, because this is an unfunded effort, would be really detailed guidelines that would not only give examples from English or from a couple of languages, but that would try to cover all the different groups of languages that might do things differently. And then it could be possible to say that even though not even in Slavic languages accusative is the only definitive marker of core versus non-core arguments, it could at least give you a clue that usually, so let's say, accusatives are still objects while non-accusatives are no longer objects. unless you prove that there is some exception in that language. So I think that would be helpful, because otherwise people are just lost in the fog and trying to find out what exactly it means, and the English examples will not really help you. They didn't help me, definitely, in the beginning.
We will have some working meetings afterwards, after the talk, so maybe we can discuss them, those questions.
Yeah, I'll be here until tomorrow afternoon, so I'm happy to meet with whoever wants to.
Are there any questions? More questions?
Yeah.
Sorry, there are really no other questions. When we prepared this LFG tree bank, the UD tree bank that started from LFG, we read the guidelines very carefully, many times, and there are lots of inconsistencies, right? Even when it comes to the definition of object, it's kind of in two places there are conflicting definitions. Are you planning to kind of, have some procedure of writing the guidelines in a more consistent way so that people are not confused who come to UD? Or what's the procedure?
We are planning to look for volunteers. Look for volunteers who would like to improve the guidelines.
It's to be organized, right? Because volunteers start writing pieces of guidelines, it's going to be even worse, right? So there must be some structure, I think.
Well, I think the first thing is, I believe I know what you're referring to. It will be something about the indirect objects or something, but please urge us. I know you've already written about it. I don't remember whether it was or was not a pull request to the guideline, but everyone is actually allowed to at least suggest the modification of the documentation. If the suggestion means changing the guidelines, then it's a difficult process, because we don't really want to change the guidelines very frequently. That's a sure way of killing the project, because then people just wouldn't be able to cope with it. So we will probably change it once again in a year or two if there's enough demand. But if that's just a clarification, if you find like obvious discrepancy between two different places in the guidelines, then it should be changed. It should be decided what's the better formulation, and the other should be modified. And then I think maybe if you suggest the modification, unless you did already, and then I think you have the right access to the documentation, so you could even do it. But if you don't feel like enforcing it that way, then you can submit like a pull request, and then if no one responds, it's because it's possible that like one in the community believes it's his particular task, then please urge us again, because then I believe eventually we should act upon. This should not happen, that the guidelines are misleading. And I'm sorry for that, but we really don't have a group of editors who would make sure that everything works. The way the guidelines started was that it was originally written by the core group, the version 1, then the version 2 was written by even smaller group, essentially mostly Joachim and me and Sebastian Schuster and a few others. And I think Joachim tried to go over everything and make sure it's consistent, but that everything was already too big at that point, so it's possible that he overlooked this discrepancy, and probably others as well. And it's not his fault. I overlooked it as well, but I didn't even read that part. So yeah, that's unfortunate consequence of all the nature of the project.
And so, thank you very much for wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.